Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon. Miss Myers or Dr. Myers, I had a question. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but you know how there's like, in order to use the Wi-Fi on campus, there's like this antivirus software you have to download. Do you know if you're supposed to re-download it every time you try to connect to the Wi-Fi?
You're not supposed to have to, but I find that when I use the Wi-Fi on campus, there are times where I have to.
You have to just, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and it's not. If it keeps being a problem, try calling the help desk. They may be able to help you like reset a setting. But yeah, I've had that when I go to teach in the classrooms and I am using the Wi-Fi where every single time I have to do
I was
that.
literally doing work for like class, and then just in the middle of it just stopped. The Wi-Fi stopped working, and it took me like 30 minutes to to get back connected.
Yeah, I had a student who was late to class this morning because she couldn't get on. So I completely understand. All right, hello everyone. A lot of you are signing on here. More people will be joining soon, I know. So today we're going to start going over chapter 2, which talks about research methods and how we do research in psychology. So we have another explain it to the media quiz. I am there's more than one person who's having internet problems, so woohoo. Thanks for letting me know. Hopefully it'll be better than Monday. But we're going to start with the explain it to the media quiz. So if you need to, have your camera off during that to help with the internet, that's fine. You can see Simba being a daredevil right over here. If you want a little bit of amusement.
No, how did you do that? How do I do that? Oh, I'm not.
If you go down to the bottom, there's a stop video option next to the mute button. So you can do that. And I'm going to go ahead and remind you how to find the quiz. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay, you're going to see my email momentarily. There we go. Okay. So go ahead and log on to Blackboard and go to our classes page, Introduction to Psychology, slide 10103. And then near the bottom of your list on the left-hand side, there will be exams and quizzes. And you just pick the second one, the Explain It to the Media Quiz 2. So it's under Exams and Quizzes, Explain It to the Media Quiz 2. And I'm going to give everyone till about 1:15. We'll see how that goes. If we need more time, we'll take more time. But it shouldn't kick you out this time. I made it so that it's just open right now. So start taking that. I'm going to go ahead and stop screen share. So please just in the chat type if you need help finding it. But that way I will be able to answer questions in the chat more easily. Zoom the recording, there we go, so that I can post this on YouTube and get the captions up for y'all. I think the second half of class didn't record after I signed out and signed back in on Monday. So if anyone needs me to like recover that material, please just shoot me an email and I can make a little video where I go over it. But this should be okay today. It will record no problem. And if you are having issues with your internet, I'm really sorry. I think it is just like this traffic issue on campus, but know that my end seems to be okay. Like all of your videos look okay and whatnot. when you do have them on. So I think that it should be recording okay. So catch what you can now. And then if you need to, go back and rewatch it later. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and share the PowerPoint. And get my clicker going here. And make sure that I have the chat pulled up so that I can see if y'all ask any questions. Alrighty, and make sure that I'm clicked there. Clear this out of the way here. Pull this up. Grab this. Okay, so we are going to talk about research in psychology and how we study all the stuff we've already been talking about. So to illustrate how psychologists do research, I'm going to use an example of eating, specifically binge eating. So why talk about eating? Well, most of us eat every day, right? Second, my research focuses on body image and eating behavior. And I have in the past run therapy intervention groups that focus specifically on binge eating behavior. So it's something I'm very familiar with. And it's easy for me to come up with examples. So hopefully this will be something that will resonate with all of you. So I always use these quotes to start off my research lectures because I think they really show the importance of doing research. So back in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle said, "The brain is an organ of minor importance." Clearly, we know that's not true now, right? But back then, they really thought that the ancient Egyptians, when they mummified bodies, would preserve a lot of the organs, but they actually just yanked the brain out through the nose and pitched it when they went to mummify the body because they just didn't think it was important. Everything that can be invented has been invented, said Charles Duell, US Patent Office in 1899. Well, I don't know about y'all, but that would mean much of what's around me right now, right, would not have been invented and we didn't need it, apparently. So clearly, again, when we're prognosticating about the future, we're not always right. So research is really important to help us continue these developments. Another quote is, "There's no reason for any individual to have a computer in their home." And this was Ken Olson of Digital Equipment Corp. Now, to be fair, back in the 70s, when he made this statement, a computer would have like taken over this entire room and then like more space, right? So sure, that makes sense, right? But like, I'm talking to you on a computer. My husband's computer is right here. Right, this is a computer. I don't know if you all realize, but you have more computing power in your pocket than the Apollo space missions had, right? So again, this is a function of like not realizing how things would advance. So research is really important. It helps us to advance science. It helps us to discover new things about the world around us and about people. So it's definitely something that we in psychology really emphasize. So what is research? It's the systematic search for facts through the careful use of observations and investigations. The systematic search for facts through the careful use of careful observations and investigations. And so obviously these are going to look different for different types of research, right? So if you do research in the humanities, this might involve being in a library and reading old tomes, right? If you're doing research in biology, this might involve taking the Ocean Explorer, our research vessel out and collecting data, collecting samples, specimens, and bringing them back. If you're in chemistry, it might be, combining things and putting them through any number of scanning devices that we have on campus. Right? In psychology, this can look a bunch of different ways, but usually you're dealing with people. There are some psychology experiments that are done with animals. We'll cover those as well. But typically we're looking at people. Only by rigorously testing a theory, or like if we're talking about therapy, maybe a technique, On a representative group of subjects or participants, can we evaluate the accuracy and usefulness of those theories, of that therapy, of whatever we're trying to test? Yes, all of the PowerPoints are on Blackboard for the entire semester. So you can find all the PowerPoints for the entire semester. I believe they're under lecture notes. So yes, this can be really tricky, as you can imagine, because you're dealing with people, right? So it's really challenging for clinical researchers or any researchers within psychology, because you're trying to do things like measure unconscious motives. So the person themselves might not even be aware, right, that they have these motives, but you've got to try to figure them out, right? That gets tricky. We might be assessing private thoughts, right? So maybe the person does know what they're thinking, but they don't want to tell you, right? So they're going to be really careful about how they answer your questions. And then also monitoring mood changes, right? So we might be trying to figure out, like, when does someone go from just being okay to being sad, and from sad to being depressed, right? And that can be really hard to determine. And we don't really have good answers for that per se. So this becomes really tricky because we're dealing with people, and people are pretty complex organisms. So how do we try to do this the best way we can? We use the scientific method. So those of you who are in your lab classes this semester or have taken lab classes in high school, this will seem pretty familiar to you. This is really similar to what we do in any of the natural sciences. And in fact, I think I've mentioned this before. In some institutions, psychology is actually classified as a natural science. It sort of straddles the line between social science and natural science. So as in other sciences, researchers have to use the scientific method. It involves systematically gathering and evaluating information. Systematically gathering and evaluating information through careful observations to gain understanding of a phenomenon. I'll say that whole thing again because it's very wordy. So it involves systematically gathering and evaluating information through careful observations to gain an understanding of a phenomenon. So yeah, the Wi-Fi is really awful. Apparently, it's cutting in and out. I'm really sorry. Like, I have no way to fix it from my end, but do know that as soon as this processes, it will be on YouTube, and the YouTube link will be posted on Blackboard, and you'll be able to have it with the captions you can follow. So I'm sorry that the Wi-Fi sucks, guys. Maybe I'll talk to IT and see if there's any way we can make it better, because I want you to get as much as you can out of this class. So science in general is the pursuit of systemized knowledge through observation. And again, as we just talked about, there's lots of different ways to observe. Observing people might involve actually just sort of sitting in a public place and observing them. It might involve giving them questionnaires to fill out. It might involve doing a brain scan, or something like skin conductivity test, or pulse, or even getting their cortisol levels, for example. So the objectives of science are description, so describing something. Maybe it's a situation, maybe it's a technique, maybe it's a facet of personality, maybe it's the way we remember things, right? So we're trying to describe what's going on. Then we want to predict what the outcome will be. So for example, if we're doing therapy, our prediction is hopefully going to be the person will get better, right? Like, we really want the person to get better. But, you know, we can't just assume they will. We need to actually test that through science. And then control. We try to control the variables that can be controlled, to rule out things that might get in the way. And we'll talk a lot about that when we talk about experiments. And we also try to control the outcome for something like therapy or a prevention program where we're trying to help people be better, feel better, right? And then understanding, that's a big part of psychology. Psychology really kind of is like the science of trying to understand ourselves, right? Like we're just trying to understand why people are the way they are. So maybe we're trying to understand disorders, we're trying to understand why things happen the way they do. And there's two different types of understanding. There's nomothetic understanding. Much of what we'll do this semester, and actually in a lot of your psych classes, is nomothetic understanding, which is basically definition level, broad understanding of a concept, an idea that would apply to everybody. So the way I remember this is nomo is the same root as name. So it's sort of like you're naming the thing for everybody. Idiographic understanding is something you would do more in therapy, where you're trying to understand the individual who's right in front of you. And here, I just use the I to remind me of individual to remember this one. So, how do we actually use the scientific method? Well, we use it to obtain scientific evidence, and there are 3 steps. So we want to formulate testable hypotheses. A hypothesis is a tentative statement between 2 variables. Oftentimes, your own observations or thoughts about things may generate your research questions, and then you use what's previously out there published in the literature to help you generate your hypothesis. So hypothesis is essentially saying, I believe this to be true. And then you go and actually test that with your research, which is step 2. You go ahead and you gather appropriate data to test the hypothesis. And we use various research methods to do that. And we'll talk about those shortly throughout these. And then we use statistics to analyze our findings. If you go on to especially a PhD program in psychology, you will do a lot of statistics because it is how we do our science. And the results of our analyses will either support our hypothesis, and then we can sort of continue on, or it might refute our hypothesis or not support it. And if that's the case, then we might need to go back and rethink about our hypothesis, or maybe we realize like just our original hypothesis was wrong and we still found something kind of cool. So then we report our findings. And in psychology, we do this a variety of ways. So we might present them at professional conferences, either through posters, kind of like a big science fair, or through a talk given. I will be doing this in November. I have a poster and 2 talks I'll be giving at the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. We can also publish it in, most of the time for psychologists, this will be in journals. So we write research articles that will be published in these journals. It goes through a giant process called peer review that takes a while, and then it's out there and accessible. Or sometimes psychologists will actually publish these in like just a book of, you know, something you could pick up at Kogut or the library. So that's another possibility as well. And more, the way we are reporting our findings is actually online. So a lot of psychologists, once their scientific paper comes out, they'll actually tweet about their results and try to make it more accessible for the public. So back to our idea about binge eating. One of the things we might start wondering is, why do people eat? So go ahead and throw in the chat your ideas about why we bother to eat. Why do people eat? Why do you eat? Nutrition, yes, very important. Hunger, to live, to gain energy, yeah, we need to. Sometimes just because I'm bored, yes. To stay alive, build muscle, energy, you're just hungry, it tastes good, yeah. Depression, yes. Yeah, you all are really hitting on everything I have on the slide. Hunger is probably the primary one, right? One thing I don't know if anyone else said is sometimes it's just a social thing, right? Like when we're not in the COVID era, let's all go out to, grab a nice dinner together. Some drugs can make you pretty hungry. Yeah, that's a really good point. Sometimes other things that we consume make us hungrier as well. So if you're drinking something that's really salty, right? Things along those lines. Someone said if you're bored, yeah. I don't know if anyone else had this problem while you were in quarantine, but I ate a lot more than usual, right? I would just sort of like wander to the pantry and get another snack. So that's certainly something that could happen. Some people do it to self-nurture. So maybe you do it to celebrate, right? So you've had a big accomplishment, so you go out, or you're just having a crummy day, and so you treat yourself to something you really enjoy. And some people do it to avoid negative emotions. So this kind of goes along with depression. So yeah, maybe this is a way that you don't have to think about things if you just take the time to eat. Yeah, and someone else just said, sometimes we forget and your friends make you to do that, right? Yeah, that's only, sometimes you only eat because you have to. Yeah, that certainly can happen. So based on all that, our hypothesis might be that bingers, people who binge eat, will be more likely to binge eat in response to negative moods than to neutral moods. That kind of makes sense based on what we just talked about. And for those of you who aren't familiar, binge eating is eating a large amount of food in a short amount of time with a sense of loss of control. The people who binge eat will eat something on the order of like 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 calories in a sitting. And they just feel like they can't stop. People have equated it to something like binge drinking, just feeling like you don't want to stop, feeling really good while you're doing it. This can happen in the context of bulimia nervosa, which is one of the eating disorders, or some people just occasionally binge, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a disorder of some kind. And we all have culturally sanctioned binges as well. So, for example, Thanksgiving, right? We don't necessarily feel loss of control, but we certainly eat way more calories than we usually would, right? So that's a culturally sanctioned binge that wouldn't be indicative of a disorder, but certainly is eating way more food than usual. If you eat the whole Chipotle burrito in one sitting, that can feel like a binge, right? But doesn't necessarily mean you have a disorder. So now we're going to talk about different ways we can start to address that hypothesis using different types of research methodology in psychology. And we'll start by talking about the case study. So for the case study, you describe one person in great detail. It provides a detailed interpretive description of that person's life and psychological problems. Oftentimes, although not exclusively, this is someone who is in therapy, and their therapist will say, this is pretty interesting, why don't we write this up as a case study? And it can serve as a really good source of new ideas about behavior. So Freud's theories, for example, were entirely based on case studies. He didn't do any other kind of research. It's a really good inspiration for further research because it can offer tentative support for a theory or idea. It can challenge the assumptions of something that already exists. It can maybe inspire new techniques. And it can offer opportunities to study unusual problems. So for example, if you want to study someone with dissociative identity disorder, what we used to call multiple personality disorder, you're not going to find a sample of 100 people with that disorder. It's pretty rare. So you might only see one case in your whole career, and so then you would write it up as a case study. If you think you have something to contribute to the scientific literature by writing about that person, you would get that person's consent, and you would also de-identify their information to protect them. One example of a case study is the case of little Hans. So little Hans was a young boy frightened of horses that was a patient of Freud's. And Freud decided that little Hans's fear of horses was linked to what he called the Oedipal complex. And the Oedipal complex is the desire of a male child to seduce his mother and get rid of his father. If you take Psych 102, we'll talk about that in a lot more detail. Certainly in theories of personality as well. So Freud saw the fact that little Hans had seen a horse fall in the street right next to him as completely insignificant. Hi, Simba. You want to be in class? So, as you can see, case studies are going to be partially determined by who's writing. One of the most prominent people who studied individual cases is Alois Alzheimer. In the early 1900s, he described a patient exhibiting symptoms of forgetfulness, disorientation, and a general decline in level of functioning. The patient he described was later referred to as having Alzheimer's disease after Alois, and because he was the first to give a detailed descriptive account of the disease. So again, here's an example where it can put out ideas for new disorders, new information. So if we're thinking about our example of binge eating, okay, we might recall that we're interested in investigating the relationship between negative emotions and binge eating. So maybe we have a therapy client who their presenting problem is binge eating. When they're talking about their history with their family, she tells you that when she was growing up, she lived with her mom and her grandma. Her mom worked outside the home, and so her grandma cared for her after school. And whenever she came home feeling sad or depressed or like just had a really yucky day, her grandmother would bake and she'd say, "Eat, eat." Whenever I recount this case, I think of my Polish grandmother who used to always say this, "Eat, eat," and say, "You'll feel better if you eat." So as a psychologist, you might start thinking, when she was a child, she ate whenever she experienced negative emotions. Maybe that's the basis for her binging now. Now, there are limitations to the case study technique, as you can imagine. So one part that we saw in the case of little Hans is a bias on the part of the observer, or even the person who's reported. So for example, little Hans's father, who brought Hans to Freud as a patient, was a great fan of Freud's work. He had read all Freud's books, followed his career. So little Hans's father tended to report information that supported Freud's theories and ignore or de-emphasize the information that it did not. And obviously Freud did this himself by sort of ignoring the horse falling thing, right? Case studies also rely on subjective evidence rather than objective things that can be directly observed. So this means case studies have low internal validity, which basically means it's really hard to rule out all possible causes except for one, right? It's just not possible because it's only one person. There could be a lot of different things that are influencing them. Case studies also make it really hard to generalize because, again, you're only looking at one person, right? They're describing this one person in great detail, but the information is often relevant only to that person. So it doesn't generalize to all people who might even have the same problems, right? So this means it has low external validity. And basically external validity is just a fancy way of saying generalizability. So low external validity just means it's really hard to generalize beyond that particular study, that particular case study, right? So yeah, that becomes really important here. We need to keep that in mind. So how do we solve that? How do we do research better as psychologists? So one of the ways that's more rigorous and is used quite frequently in psychology, honestly, is the correlational method. Correlation is the degree to which events or characteristics vary with each other. So it essentially looks at the relationship between or among two variables, or we can extend it to more than that. So it measures the strength of the relationship. How strong is that relationship between the two variables? And the variables are assessed as they exist in nature. There's no experimental manipulation. We're not forcing people to do anything. Typically, it's self-report measures. They come in and they tell us how they're feeling, thinking, behaving, etc. A good example of a correlational study would be having someone fill out a questionnaire about stress and a questionnaire about depression. So 2 questionnaires, one about stress, one about depression. And then you examine how those variables relate. In this case, you're not bringing the subjects in and purposely stressing them out. And yes, we can do that in psychology. We might give people like impossible puzzles to solve to stress them out. We're not bringing them into the lab and trying to make them depressed. We'll talk in a couple slides about how we would actually do that. How do you make someone experience negative mood in the lab? We always undo it at the end of the study, right? We're not doing either of those things. We're just measuring based on how you're doing right now. How depressed are you? How stressed are you? Perhaps the most important thing to remember when interpreting correlations, thinking about correlations, is that correlation does not imply causation. So what that means is if you know there's a correlation between 2 variables, that doesn't tell you whether one of them causes the other or not. So for example, with our depression and stress study, if you find that people with high levels of stress also have high levels of depression, it doesn't tell you that stress causes depression. Because it could easily be, yes, it could be that you're stressed out so you feel depressed. But it could be that because you're depressed and the symptoms of depression make you less productive, you feel stressed out. Or it could be there's a third thing altogether. Yes, coffee and cancer is a good example, Elijah. Or you often see like the media report things like chocolate cures blah, blah, blah. And they've just done like a correlational study, right? So yeah, these are examples of that. There could be a third thing involved, right? So one thing I've often seen is like, oh, well, race relates to XYZ. Well, if you really look at it, it's often not race. It's often to do with class, access to healthcare, things along those lines, right? Where you live, your zip code. So in our case of stressed and depressed, maybe you're stressed and depressed because of something else going on, right? So there could be a third variable happening, like a global pandemic or someone in your life has passed away, right? So those, we know there's a relationship between the 2 things, but it doesn't tell us whether one causes the other one. That's really important to remember. And again, something the media get wrong all the time. So whenever you hear the media say something like, well, no study shows this causes this, take it with a grain of salt, because most of the time those are just like studies where they ask people like, do you eat a lot of chocolate, right? And then they see if they have cancer. So it's not like they've randomly assigned someone to eat chocolate and someone not to. It's not what happens, right? So that's really important to keep in mind. Another important thing, and now we're starting to get into the statsy piece of this, is that the magnitude of the correlation gives us really important information. So it tells us about the direction of the correlation and also how strong it is. So correlations range from +1 to -1. And +1 and -1 are equally strong correlations. 0 is actually the weakest correlation. So this is something people kind of get tripped up on at first, is they'll think like -1 is the weakest correlation. In fact, 0. And the easiest way to remember this is if there's 0, there's no correlation. So that's the weakest correlation. So essentially, the closer you are to +1 or -1, the stronger the relationship between the 2 variables are. And it just tells us the direction of that relationship. So I always like to use charts to demonstrate this, because I think it's easier to visualize. So a positive correlation is where the variables change in the same direction. So in this case, this is the example we were just using. People who have high scores on the stress scale also have high scores on the depression scale. So you can see that the line goes up. People who score A 7 on the stress scale are much more likely to score somewhere in the like 25 range on the depression scale. But again, that doesn't mean one is causing the other. That's a positive correlation. One variable goes up, the other one also goes up. Now, a negative correlation is where one variable goes up and the other one goes down, okay? So the example here is depression and activity level. So here you see people who are scoring in like the 25 range on this depression scale are scoring really low on activities. So, you know, less than 1 number of activities over the past 3 months, right? And you see the opposite. If you go out to people who are engaging in a lot of activities, they're scoring under 15 on this depression scale. So that is a negative correlation. Now, just like the positive correlation, this doesn't mean one causes the other. So it certainly could be that because you're depressed, you're engaging in fewer activities you enjoy. And in fact, that is a symptom of depression that we use to diagnose depression called anhedonia. Not something you guys need to know for a test or anything, but I always just like to start introducing these terms. So that could be happening. But we also know from research that people who engage in fewer activities they enjoy are more likely to feel depressed. So you can start to see how maybe this could be cyclical for people with depression, right? It could also be, again, there's some third thing going on. You know, maybe you got, you know, a severe injury, maybe a spinal cord injury, right? And so you can't go out and do activities and you're having a hard time coping with the injury. Okay, so that's the negative correlation. And then just to kind of remind you that negative correlations and positive correlations can be equally strong, I'll just have you look at the positive one versus the negative one. It's either they're like mirror images of each other, the graphs. That means that they are equally strong correlations. And again, the weakest correlation is no correlation, zero correlation. So as you can see here, the data don't really form any kind of line. They're kind of all over the place. And this happens with a lot of variables in psychology. We'll hypothesize these two things are related and not at all, right? And that happens, that's fine. So in this case, it's looking at depression and IQ, intelligence quotient. And we know from a lot of research, these two things are not related. You can be Einstein level smart and be depressed. You can be Einstein level smart and be perfectly happy. You can be someone with a severe developmental delay and be depressed. You can be someone with a severe developmental delay and be perfectly happy. So those two things are not related at all. There are also lots of ways that we have extended the correlational method. So instead of just looking at two variables, we look at it in more complex ways. So one thing we do with disorders is what's called epidemiological studies. And this looks at how often disorders are occurring at the population level. And we look at incidence and prevalence. Incidence is the number of new cases, that emerge during a given time. So you might talk about the incidence of COVID per day, for example, or the incidence of depression over the past year. Okay, so incidence is the number of new cases. The way I remember this is just the N in incidence right there at the beginning, reminding me of the word new. Prevalence is the total number of cases in the population at any given time. So the total number of cases right now, right? So like the incidence of COVID yesterday, I think was something like 800 new cases in Virginia. But like the overall number of people who have COVID in Virginia, the prevalence is much higher, right? Because there are people who have been diagnosed on previous days. And again, same thing with mental disorders, right? So you could have new cases of a mental disorder, but you've still got people who've already been diagnosed previously with that disorder. So the graph down in the corner here shows the prevalence of depression among different age groups. And it also breaks it out by gender. And so what you can see is that it really spikes, especially for females, in sort of the adolescence, or really the college late adolescence, college age. And if we said, oh, well, women are always higher on depression, well, if we look at 13 to 17, those adolescent years, no, right? Yes, I will repeat the incidence and prevalence definition. So incidence is the number of new cases in a given time, and prevalence is the number of total cases. Incidence, new, prevalence, total. Glad to repeat that, because these get tricky. Longitudinal studies involve observing the same participants on multiple occasions over a long period of time. So you look at correlations at different times. So really large scale longitudinal studies actually will look at, sometimes they do from birth until, as long as they can, 20, things like that. Sometimes longitudinal studies are only a couple years. These can be really important because these really, even though you have full causality, you can start to see what predicts something in the future, right? So the example I always give from body image field is if someone is feeling bad about their body at, age of 7, we know from longitudinal studies that at age, 10, 12, they're much more likely to start developing some of these disordered eating behaviors, whether it's binge eating, we've been talking about, or excessive fasting. So let's use our example here. So this is another example of an extended type of correlation. So participants can complete what's called a food diary. So they would fill out the types and quantities of foods they consume. You might do this for a day, you might have them do it for a week, for example. And along with other questions, they're asked the following questions about their mood and eating. So indicate the type of mood you were experiencing before you ate. And I've seen different ways of doing this. One is to go from very negative to very positive. That's a little vague, right? So I've seen people be more specific about, were you angry? Were you sad? Things along those lines. You can just have them indicate whether they consider this a binge or not, and then have them rate the severity of the binge from mild to severe. And then using statistics, you can now look at the relationship between mood and the occurrence of the binges. So you look at, on average, what was the mood they were feeling before they binged, and the severity of the binge. So is this a positive correlation that if their mood was very negative, they're much more likely to binge? Or is there no correlation? And we can express that quantitatively using what's called the correlation coefficient. So that's a statistic that we use. All right, I'm going to start now talking about the experimental method, and we won't get through all of this today, but we'll talk about it more on Monday. But the experimental method is rigorous in different ways than the correlational method. Some people consider the experimental method the gold standard, but it has drawbacks just like anything else. So I would say the experimental and the correlational methods are probably used equally in psychological studies now. And I've done both for my own research. So the experiment allows for determination of a causal relation between two variables. So the experiment involves random assignment of participants to experimental conditions. So you walk in the door, you're equally likely to be assigned to different groups. And we'll talk more about random assignment on the next slide. Manipulation of what they call the independent variable, or the IV. So this is believed to cause a change in the other variable, which we call the dependent variable, DV. It's called the dependent variable because it's dependent on what happens with the independent variable. So it's assumed to be controlled by what happens with the IV, the independent variable. So an example here. Maybe our independent variable would be food deprivation. So we would hypothesize that people who have been deprived of food will eat more than people who have not been deprived of food. Okay, and this is something we do, and we don't deprive them for very long. We'll just tell them, like, hey, for X amount of hours, maybe 3 hours before you come into the lab, please don't eat anything. And then our dependent variable is going to be the amount of food consumed. And oftentimes we do this just by weighing the food before the participant comes in and after they leave. Or maybe we do it based on number of things. So if you give them donuts, do they eat one donut or do they eat a dozen donuts? So the experimental group would have participants who will be food deprived. So we tell them, please don't eat anything for 3 hours before you come in. And the control group would be what we call the ad lib eaters. We don't give them any kind of instruction. So we want to get similar participants in each of these groups. We don't want to put, for example, all the athletes in one group, right? Because they might be more voracious eaters, particularly if they've just had a practice, right? We don't want to put, everyone of a certain weight class in one group and other weight class in another group. We want to try to make them as similar as possible. So our hypothesis for this study would be that bingers will be more likely to binge eat in response to negative moods than neutral moods, and that having that deprivation is also going to influence it. Should have thrown that up for you, because it's the same thing I'm saying. All right, so here's what we do. So we have the people come in, and we have, we assess their mood, and then we induce mood in them. So for the experimental group, we're gonna try to make them experience depressed mood. For the control group, we're gonna try to make them feel pretty neutral, pretty meh, pretty okay. And then we will reassess mood afterwards to make sure that we actually got the mood change we wanted to. And then we assess their food intake. We, again, weigh it or count the number of what they eat. So how do we manipulate depressed mood? Well, there are these cards you can give people with depression statements. They're called the Belton mood cards. So here are some examples. Today is neither better nor worse than any other day. However, I feel a little low today. Sometimes I wonder whether school is all that worthwhile. Every now and then I feel so tired and gloomy, I'd rather just sit than do anything. And so, excuse me. Essentially, you're just trying to get the person to feel a little more down, a little more sort of sitting with the fact that, like, maybe today's not the greatest day. The neutral statements are essentially just sort of like factoids. So, like, Oklahoma City is the largest city in the world in area. Agricultural products comprise 70% of the income. Some streets were still said to be listed under the old name. So when most of us read, thank you for saying bless you, I appreciate that. So when someone reads these, they're just gonna feel like, okay, fine, whatever. They're not gonna necessarily feel more or less depressed. So again, we have everybody come in, we do a mood assessment, we have them read one of these sets of statements or the other, depending on which group they're assigned to, and then we'll reassess their mood. And then we'll assess their food intake. And I'm realizing, I think I'm missing a slide in here. Let me make sure I didn't skip it. There we go. I did skip the slide, so I apologize. I'll come back to it because this one's really important. So the experimental method, you try to control everything you can. So this is why we would, have people come into the lab. We're going to assess them before and after. We're going to put everybody in the same room with the same conditions, right? Same lighting, all that good stuff. Same food available for them to eat. So we're trying to eliminate all of what we call confounds, or we sometimes call these nuisance variables. And they're called that just because they get in the way of us getting the data we want to get. These are variables other than the independent variable that may also be affecting the dependent variable. And these can skew results as a result. So an example I always give is, let's say you're doing an experiment where you're trying to get someone to remember something, like a list of words, and the fire alarm goes off in the middle of your study, right? They're not going to be able to pay attention to what you're doing. You're probably going to have to throw that data out, right? So you want to make sure that if you're conducting a study like that, you're in a quiet space where the person can concentrate. 3 features are used in experiments to try to guard against compounds. So one is using this control versus experimental group we just saw highlighted in our study. So the control group is a group of participants who are not exposed to the independent variable, but whose experience is really similar to that of the experimental group. So in our study we just talked about is the people who read the factoids, the neutral statements, rather than the statements that we're trying to sort of induce depression. And by comparing the outcome of these 2 groups, researchers can better determine whether the independent variable is actually affecting things. Random assignment is really important. So every participant in the experiment is just as likely to be placed in the experimental group as they are to be placed in the control group. And the old school way we did this was we would actually just like flip a coin when the person walked in or right before, or people would have them draw things out of a basket or a hat to determine which group they'd be in. Nowadays, we typically actually do it using random number generators on the computer. So I use a website called random.org that will generate random integers for you. You just associate an integer with every group. So maybe 1 for experiment, 2 for control. And then it just tells you, okay, the next participant who comes in is a 2. So they're in the control group. I also use this when I write tests so that I make sure my multiple choice answers aren't all C, for example. So everything's kind of mixed up. Blind design becomes really important when we're doing something like testing a new therapy. So it's built around the idea of placebo therapy, which is the idea that substituting an imitation, something that looks or feels like the new treatment, but isn't. This is a lot easier to think about when we think about medication trials, right? So if we think about trying a new antidepressant, for example. So the experimental group would get the actual medication, but the control group would get a pill that was shaped just like the other one, colored the same imprints, everything, but it would just be a sugar pill. And the reason we do placebo therapy is to try to get rid of experimental bias, which is also sometimes called the Rosenthal effect, which is another term on your computer, where experimenters may have expectations that they unintentionally transmit to their participants. So the example I always use here, using my own bad acting skills, fully admitting that, is that someone might say, here, try this medication. I think it's really gonna help you, right? Versus, try this medication. I think it's really gonna help you, right? So again, it's not gonna be as dramatic as that, but we can unintentionally transmit our own expectations to participants. And in fact, they've even shown this in rats. When people are told they have smarter rats, the rats actually do better, even though the rats are identical to the group that are told they have dumb rats. Okay, so this makes a huge difference. And there are different types of blind designs we can use. The single blind design is where the participant, the person getting the therapy, doesn't know if they're getting the real thing or the placebo. The double blind is where neither the participant nor the person giving it to them know. So in this case, there would be like a principal investigator who would know who's getting what meds that day. But the actual person handing them out, say a research assistant, wouldn't know who has the meds, who has the placebo. And then there's also triple blind. So this would be if we're rating someone's behavior. So we have kiddos we're giving an ADHD meds to. And then we have someone say, like, how hyperactive are they actually acting? In the case of a triple blind design, they also would not know that whether or not this person got the medication or the placebo. Although with kids with ADHD, it can be easy to tell. I had a grad school professor who did some of these studies, and he said the kids would literally come in and be like, "It's a placebo day." So, sometimes it's pretty obvious. All right, we'll stop there for today, and I will see you all on Monday. Everyone have a great weekend, and please let me know if you have any questions about anything.